I often get the question, Mary, how do I ferment vegetables? But sometimes, about a week or so later, that's followed up with another note that says, oh no, something went wrong. And I completely understand that, because fermenting vegetables is a process of trial and error, and there is a little bit of a learning curve. And so today, in the News from Mary's Nest, we're going to tackle some of those problems that we can encounter when we ferment vegetables. Hi, sweet friends. I'm Mary, and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, sourdough, ferments, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel, and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Now, if you've never fermented vegetables before and you want to get started with that, I'll link to my playlist where I show you how to make sauerkraut and fermented carrot sticks and fermented ginger slaw and pickles and jardinera and all of these different types of fermented vegetables. And hopefully all will go well. But if you do run into any trouble, then you can come back and watch this video where we're going to talk about all the various things you might have to tackle. Now, one of the first complaints that I hear from people about fermented vegetables is that they can be mushy. And that is true. They can be mushy. And that's why you need to take steps to prevent that. And two of the things that help to prevent your ferments being mushy are salt and tannins. The salt helps in two ways. It helps with the crispiness, and it also helps tamp down the bad bacteria and allow the good bacteria to flourish. But probably the most important thing when it comes to keeping fermented vegetables crisp is to make sure that you have something in your jar that has tannins in it. And the things that contain tannins are grape leaves, tea leaves, bay leaves, I believe horseradish leaves too contain tannins, and you'll want to put some of that into your fermentation jar. Now, if you decide you want to use a tea bag, which are in pretty much everyone's pantry, I like to use just one black tea bag. It can be decaffeinated or caffeinated, it doesn't matter. Both contain tannins, and you'll just put it in the bottom of your jar, and then you'll proceed with your fermentation process. Another option is putting in a couple of bay leaves, and I've been experimenting with that, but I have to say I think I prefer the tea bag. The bay leaf sometimes can give a nice flavor, and they gave a very nice flavor to some fermented carrots that I made. But overall, I find that the tannins in the tea leaves really keep my ferments crisp. So that is my recommendation. Now, I've gotten the question, or I've received the question, can you use green tea? And yes, you can. Green tea has tannins too. But you might want to use two because green tea has a little less tannins than the black tea. Now, another problem that I hear is that when people go to test their ferment, after a day or two, you'll prepare it, you'll put it on your counter. In warm weather, you'll want to start to check it after 2 days. In cooler months, it'll probably take a few more days before you start seeing all the bubbling and so on and so forth. And when they go to taste it after 2 or 3 days, when people go to taste their ferment after 2 or 3 days, they find that it's very salty. And that can be true. Initially, things can taste, or ferments can taste very salty. But once you get the level of crispness that you're looking for, and you go ahead and refrigerate your ferment, it seems to mellow over time. Now, when I tasted these pickles after 2 days, because this was fermented in a warm month, after 2 days it had the right crispness that I wanted, and so I refrigerated it. But when I did take the test taste, it was a little salty, but I know to expect that. So what I did was put it in my refrigerator, let it mellow a little. It stayed crisp. I had added bay leaves to this particular batch of pickles. And now it tastes crisp and not too salty. So over time, once it goes into your refrigerator, things do mellow out a little bit. And I don't know the science exactly behind it, if the salt is more down on the bottom of the jar or whatever the case may be, but I do know over all the years that I've been fermenting that over time things do mellow in the fridge and the flavor evens out and becomes quite pleasant. Now I want to take out one of these pickles for you, and I want to show you how they've really remained quite crispy. They've been in my fridge, not exactly sure now, maybe about 2 weeks. I've got some dill in here that wants to come out with this pickle. But let me just get this out and we'll give it a taste. And then you can see that it's still quite lovely and crisp. That's delicious. It's nice and crisp, has a wonderful flavor to it, and it's not overly salty. Now, a little tip. Once you take something out, and if you were to put this in your mouth, don't put it back into your fermentation jar, because you never want to reintroduce or introduce any bad bacteria. But what if you decide that putting in the amount of salt in here that's required for a fermentation is just too much for you? You either don't want that salty taste, or you don't want that much salt because of health reasons, or whatever the case may be. Are there ways to do ferments? Are there ways to ferment vegetables without salt? And that's where I want to share with you about this book called Wild Fermentation. It's just an inexpensive paperback, and it is packed with a wealth of fermentation, a wealth of information about fermentation. And it's by Sandor Katz. And if you've done any fermenting, that name will be familiar to you, because he really is sort of like the king of fermentation. And in his book, Wild Fermentation, he addresses pretty much any question you could ever imagine about fermentation. And in his chapter on vegetable ferments like this, he talks about salt-free or low-salt fermentation. And he talks about using wine, he talks about using seeds, and he even talks about using seaweed. And just to share with you one of the examples that he has, he talks about making sauerkraut with savory seeds instead of any salt. And he takes a fair amount of seeds. He's using dill seeds and caraway and celery seeds and so on and so forth. He uses a lot of seeds. He grinds them all up and he mixes them and pounds them with the cabbage when he goes to make sauerkraut. And the seeds act in the same way that the salt does. I find this fascinating. And it helps to keep the cabbage crunchy, and it helps to allow for the fermentation process to take place. And it helps with, the seeds help with tamping down the bad bacteria, allowing the good bacteria to flourish, and doing all of this without any salt. So it's quite fascinating. So if you're interested in not using salt to do a ferment, savory seeds might be a very interesting option. And just while I have his book out here, and I'll be sure to put a link in, this is an older version, there might be newer versions out, but as I said, it's just a paperback and it's a relatively thin, but packed with information. And I'll put a link in the description below where you can find this. But just to give you a little, you know, whenever I mention a book, I like to just read the table of contents to you. And he does everything. He's got lots of recipes in here. The foreword is written by Sally Fallon, who, you know, wrote Nourishing Traditions, a book that we talked about, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. And then he talks about the history of fermentation. He talks about the health benefits of fermentation. He talks about vegetable ferments, bean ferments, dairy ferments. And what's interesting, in his section on dairy ferments, he talks about vegan alternatives. So that's interesting. He talks about fermenting breads and pancakes, fermented grain porridges and beverages. And he talks about wines. So you could even make the wine that you want to use and to ferment your vegetables with instead of using salt. So that's interesting. And then he's got a chapter on beer for people who are interested in that, and vinegars. You know, I've done a lot of those. I enjoy that. And so I think that this is really a wonderful book. It's a wonderful resource if you like. It's so Wild Fermentation by Sandor Katz. And as I said, I'll put a link in the description below. But if you enjoy fermenting or you're learning about fermenting, that's a wonderful resource. and something that I have turned to time and time again. And for those of you who have seen me make vinegar, you know that I love these pH strips. Well, I learned about them from reading Sandor Katz's book. And these were so handy when I first started making fermented vegetables, because I could use these pH strips. You just pull out a little bit here and dip it into the brine. And in the book, he talks about what are proper pH levels to make sure that your ferment is correct, and so on and so forth. Now, after you do this over time, you get to know the proper texture and taste and aroma and so on and so forth. But these were just indispensable when I first started fermenting. And I still love using them for vinegar to make sure that I get down to the 3.0 pH that I like to have for my vinegars. So, but these are the type of things that you learn about in this book, which are just wonderful when you're new to fermenting and you might be a little nervous. Am I doing this right? Or whatever the case may be. And these, I'll put a link to these below in the description. They're very reasonable and they're just wonderful. And they help you become very comfortable to know that you're doing this correctly. Now, another problem that I've heard from some of you that you've experienced, and it's really kind of concerned you, is when you get a white sort of thread-like film that forms right on the top of your ferment, whether while it's fermenting on the counter or once it goes into the refrigerator. And what that is something called CAM yeast, K-A-M. And you can just put this into Google and it'll bring up a lot of pictures and you'll be able to see exactly what it looks like. Now, CAM yeast is harmless and it's somewhat of a byproduct of the lacto-fermentation or pickling process, and it's not going to hurt you, but it will give an off taste to your ferment. So if you see that CAM yeast and then you think, oh no, it's mold, I have to throw it out, it's not mold, but it will cause the ferment to become off-tasting. So if you see that and then you decide, oh, it's just CAM yeast, I'm not going to worry about it, but then you try your ferment and it tastes off, it's because of that CAM yeast. And the reason that that happens and that forms is because of the ferment's exposure to air. And that can develop sometimes because you didn't weight down your ferment while you were fermenting it on the counter, or once you put it in your refrigerator and there was a lot of opening and closing and whatnot. And as you see, not everything is submerged here. You know, it can develop then. If it does develop, you need to scoop it off or scrape it off and discard it. Because if you leave it and let it flourish, as I said, it will cause a bad flavor to your ferment. But if you see it and you catch it early and you just scoop it off, you'll be fine. And the good news about lacto-fermentation, although CAM yeast can be a little bit of a problem, mold is usually less of a problem because the nature of the brine of the lacto-fermentation tends to be a very unhospitable environment for mold. So if you see that white film form, look it up on Google, compare the pictures. If it is in fact CAM yeast, scoop it off, and then hopefully your ferment will be fine. Now, sometimes when you make a fermented vegetable, in the case of something like this, a giardiniera, you may not want it to stay really crisp like a pickle. You may want it to soften a bit, especially if you like to use it as a relish, a topping on sandwiches, putting something on a antipasta platter, where people might put some on a cracker, or you might want to put some on a hamburger. In that case, you're just going to use the salt or possibly some of the other options that we've learned from Sandor Katz if you don't want to use salt. But in this case, tannins don't play a huge role. Now, carrots and cauliflower, which are two of the main sort of ingredients in the giardiniera, and this is in the playlist that I discussed in the beginning where I show how to make different fermented vegetables, and I'll be sure to link to that again. This one I get a lot of questions about how to make. There are onions and jalapenos in here and some red peppers, sweet red bell peppers, but a lot of the main ingredients are carrots and cauliflower. Now, they tend to stay somewhat naturally crisp when you ferment them. I do like to add tannins when I make carrot sticks or carrot coins, not carrot slaw, because that's something you do want to soften up, like with sauerkraut. I don't add any tannins because I do want it to soften up a bit. You can add tannins if you like your coleslaw, if you nut your coleslaw, if you like your sauerkraut to stay crispier. It's really a matter of personal taste and what you might be using the fermented vegetable for. But carrots and cauliflower do tend to stay a little firmer. However, with carrot sticks, I like to add tannins because I want them to stay really nice and crisp. But for a giardiniera that I may top on sandwiches, as I said, or put on an antipasta platter, I like it to be a little more soft. And so I want to just show you, and I'll take a close-up picture, but I'll take a little taste of this and maybe you can see. It's got some crispness to it, but it's also soft enough to use as a relish on a sandwich. I'll take the fork and I'll show you. See, I can push the fork down through that. Can you see that? I'm going to take a picture so you can see this up close. But as I put the fork on it, see, I was able to just smash it down. So when I tasted it, it still had a nice little bit of a crunch to it. Nothing like the pickle, but it still had some firmness, so it wasn't mushy and lacking in taste, I should say. Not unattractive. But it does flatten out easily with a fork. And it's very easy if you're putting this as a relish on a sandwich or something. It's not going to be so firm and resist you. Now, let's take a look at the carrot. I'm going to get this with the knife and see first if I can cut through it. See, very easily. It had very little resistance. And I want to see if I can smash this with the fork, and I'll take a picture to overlay it. Yeah, see, this one has a little more resistance. Now I took a picture, I'm going to overlay it, but I also want to show it to you on the fork. You'll see that it has been a little flattened. It had a little more resistance than the cauliflower, but it still has some tenderness, almost like an al dente pasta. So it has some bite to the tooth, so to speak, and yet is still soft enough that if you do, put it on a cracker or you put it on a top of a hamburger or a sandwich or something like that, it's not like the person is going to be biting into a hard carrot or a hard piece of cauliflower. It's going to be nicely pickled, very similar to what you would find if you bought a giardiniera at the grocery store. So if you are looking to make pickled vegetables that are similar to those that you would buy in a jar, in this case the giardiniera in a jar at your grocery store, to something like this, you don't want to add in tannins. Because for something like this, you want to allow for that pickled process to take over and to soften these. And these have been in the refrigerator along with these pickles a couple of weeks now. And so as you see, the pickles stayed beautifully crisp, and the giardiniera is starting to soften up nicely to be perfect for a relish. And neither is mushy, because here we had salt and tannins, and here we had the salt, which played a pivotal role in keeping this to the right amount of crunchiness, yet because we didn't have the tannins, has allowed some softening as well. Yet the good bacteria was allowed to flourish and the bad bacteria was tamped down because of the salt. Now, this would be very interesting to try with the seed fermentation process that Sandra Katz talks about. If using salt is something that you want to not use, is something that you, for whatever reason the case may be, this might be an interesting experimentation for seed fermentation, savory seed as he calls it, savory seed fermentation. Now another problem that can happen when you ferment, and it's a real messy one, but it's an easy one to avoid, and that's when you put your liquid in, even if you don't fill it to the very top, which you don't want to do, and then you put your weight in. As this bubbles up, as the good bacteria is eating the various sugars that occur naturally in fruits and vegetables, as the good bacteria is eating that and creating that CO2, this is going to bubble. It's going to get very fizzy. And sometimes it gets so fizzy that even with your lid on, even with your weight in the jar, whatever the case may be, however you're fermenting, it can bubble up and bubble over. Even sometimes if you use those pickle pipes, which is helping to release the CO2, and because if you're not using the pickle pipes, you're going to be burping every day. Sometimes when you burp, it can overflow a bit, and sometimes even though you have the lid screwed on tightly, it can still seep out and it can make a mess on your counter, in your pantry, wherever you're leaving your ferment. But this is very easy to solve. Just put your ferment in a bowl. So whether you put it in your pantry or you put it on your counter, put it in a bowl. This way, if something bubbles up, when you're not supervising it, it's just going to be in this bowl. And when you go to burp it, the fizz bubbles over a little bit, the bowl's going to collect it. That's an easy fix. And another problem that I want to talk about, that a number of you have recently even have been writing to me about, is when you're fermenting vegetables, you notice that either while you're fermenting them at room temperature or once you put them in your refrigerator, that the liquid, and I'm hoping you can see it here, the liquid begins to become cloudy. And I'm going to overlay a picture. I hope that you'll be able to see it. And really down here in the bottom, you can see some of the cloudiness. And that is a concern to you. And you're like, oh no, my ferment is getting this sort of milky white, cloudy appearance to the brine. That's completely normal. That's simply caused by the process of lacto-fermentation. And it's exactly what you want to see. That, in essence, in many ways, is similar to when you hear people talk about the mother in raw vinegar. This is all your good probiotic-rich bacteria that's causing this cloudiness. And that's what you want to see. That's a good ferment, and that's going to be wonderful for your gut health. And that's a reason why do we do all of this? Why do we ferment vegetables? Because they're wonderfully rich in good bacteria. They're very rich in probiotics, which are wonderful for gut health. And once we have good gut health, we're told by scientists and told by doctors, it often means we have good overall health. So the more things that we can eat that are probiotic rich, the healthier our gut. And what's nice about ferments, and I have read this, and I hope it's true, that a teaspoon or a tablespoon of a fermented vegetable, like a sauerkraut or something like this, fermented vegetables or a pickle, has much more probiotics in it than a pill that you might buy at the store over the counter, because those have maybe been sitting on the shelf or whatever the case may be, that these are much richer in good probiotics. So a little bit of fermented vegetable can really do you a lot of good and really provide a lot of probiotics. Another book I want to mention to you, if you really enjoy learning about fermentation, is this book, The Art of Fermentation, and of course it's by Sandor Katz. This is a tome. This is going to teach you everything and anything and answer every question that you ever wanted to know about fermentation. It really goes over and above this, although I love this book and I think this is a great place to start. And really, for me, this is just an essential guide on fermentation. But if you want to take it one more step further and you want to learn about the history of fermentation, this is a real tomb. And I don't think there's anything left out. I think Sandor covers everything. He has fermentation as a co-evolutionary force. I mean, it's practical benefits of fermentation, basic concepts of equipment, fermenting sugars into alcohol, meads, wines, and ciders. And it just goes on and on. Fermenting vegetables and some fruits too. Fermenting sour tonic beverages. Fermenting milk. Fermenting grains and starchy tubers, fermenting beers and other grain-based alcoholic beverages, growing mold cultures. I don't know about that. I've not read that chapter yet, but that does seem very intriguing. And it covers things like, and I don't know if I ever say this right, it's with the soybeans, tempeh, about making tempehs. That's growing the mold cultures. Fermenting beans, seeds, and nuts. Fermenting meat, fish, and eggs. Considerations for commercial enterprises if you want to go into the fermentation business. And non-food applications of fermentations. That's fascinating. That's where he talks about agriculture and waste management and so on and so forth. He covers it all. So if you really want to delve into fermentation, that's the book for you. And I'll definitely put a link in the description below. Now, one more problem that I want to talk to you about that some of you have shared with me. When you start this process, you worry because after a day passes or 2 days passes, or 2 days pass, you don't see anything bubbling up. And I'll overlay a picture of what you should be looking for, specifically when I made this jardiniera, and how as the CO2 is being created by the good bacteria, it'll become quite bubbly and fizzy. But don't worry if after 2 days you don't see anything. It doesn't mean it's not working. It doesn't mean that it's gone bad. Usually it's just because it's cooler in your kitchen. And even in the summer, this can happen if you use a lot of air conditioning. There's a range of temperature that ferments like, and usually in the low 70s can make them, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, can make them very happy. And usually if they're in a nice warm kitchen that's in the 70s, you'll start to see some fizzing and bubbling in 2 days, sometimes 3 days. If your kitchen is cooler, if you run your air conditioner a lot, and you're not using your kitchen very much, you're not cooking very much in it, and the temperature may be around 68 degrees Fahrenheit, then it's going to take longer. Just like if your kitchen is cool in the cooler months, and maybe even with running your heat, your kitchen is only 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It's going to take longer. So sometimes you have to be patient, because sometimes in order to really get some good bacteria going and some good fermentation going, it can sometimes take up to 7 days. 1 week is not unusual when the temperatures in your kitchen or wherever you're putting your ferment is cooler than what it likes to really get going. That's why if you can find a place in your home where that's sort of like a cozy place in the 70s, your ferment will be happy. Now, you don't want it to be too hot. If the kitchen is too hot, or the area where you put your fermentation is too hot, it can ferment very quickly, and it can start bubbling very quickly, sometimes even within a few hours. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but when you accelerate the fermentation process, the bacteria can eat up the sugars, the natural sugars, very, very quickly. And then sometimes what can happen is when you go to refrigerate it, because at some point you're going to have to refrigerate it pretty quickly because the good bacteria has eaten a lot of the sugars, because the fermentation process happened very quickly, it may not have much nutrition. The good bacteria may not have much nutrition sometimes left for it. And then that is where you can sometimes, once you refrigerate your ferment and then take it out after a few days, once it's cool and you want to eat it, sometimes the texture and the taste cannot be as pleasant, cannot be as tangy and delightful for me, what I have come to know fermented vegetables to taste like. It may not have the tang or the taste that you're looking for because of that fast fermentation. So the best thing is if you have that sort of low 70s and low to mid 70s, and you can let the ferment at a slower rate, but not too slow where it's cold. It'll take you a little longer. You just have to be prepared for that. But that perfect sweet spot where it ferments nicely, it starts to create the CO2, the good bacteria has got some nice food to eat, and then you taste it and you get to a point where you're happy with it. And when you refrigerate it, there's still nutrition in there. There's still things for the bacteria to eat to keep the ferment nicely fermented and nicely tangy. And it slows down the fermentation process considerably once you ferment it. But as long as it's fermented at an appropriate time and temperature, you're going to be very happy with the end product. And the main reason for not having your ferment in too warm an area, specifically over 75 degrees Fahrenheit, is that because with a quick fermentation, you will create a mushy end product, and we definitely want to avoid that. Now today what I've discussed here are the more common problems when it comes to making vegetable ferments. If you've experienced some things that we didn't talk about today, leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them, and if I don't know the answer I'll research it and find out for you, but be sure to leave those in the comments. And also, if you do ferment vegetables, I'd love to hear about what some of your favorite ferments are. For me, the reason I have these two out, although I love fermented carrots and some of the carrot slaws and sauerkraut, I really enjoy the dill pickles and the jardiniera. And the reason that I especially like the giardiniera is just because it's so versatile and it tastes very similar to what you'll buy in the jar at the grocery store. And so it's a wonderful way to introduce your family to fermented vegetables if they're new to them. And if you'd like to learn more about traditional cooking, be sure to subscribe to my channel and then click on this video over here where I have the playlist that shows you how to ferment these as well as other vegetables as well. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.